everyone, and welcome to this CPC seminar. Today we have Alyce Raybould presenting. I will just give some information about this seminar. The seminar is recorded, but not the Q&A. We will stop the record after Alyce will finish her presentation. You can type your questions in the chat section, and I will read them at the end of Alyce's presentation. But if you want, you can also just write a question, and then you can ask your question turning your audio on in the Q&A. That is more or less it. I'm very happy today to introduce Alyce Raybould from London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. She is a PhD candidate in demography. Her thesis is about gender equality within couples, focusing on Europe and the US. In addition, Alyce attended the European Doctoral School of Demography. She's a PhD representative in the BSPS, and she's also in the steering committee of the EAPS PhD network. Today, she will present the domestic labor and the fertility gap, obstacle to childbearing or measurement fallacy. Thanks, Alyce, and now I will mute myself.
Okay, thanks very much for the introduction, Francesco, and thank you, Kim, for setting up everything. Can you guys just let me know the files uploaded? At the moment, I can't see any of you, so it's very much like I'm talking to a blank screen, but I will continue until then. So thank you so much for coming today. As Francesco said, my name is Alyce, and I am in my last year of my PhD at the London School of Hygiene, supervised by Rebecca Searland Clark and Rachel Scott. And today I'm going to be presenting a selection of work from my thesis on the topic of domestic labour and the fertility gap. So in case you're unfamiliar with the concept of the fertility gap, it arises because over the 50 years, we've seen that ideal family size has remained very stable across all high-income, low-fertility settings around the 2 mark. However, at the same time, fertility has fallen below this. So what this graph shows, I'm not sure if my mouse is visible, but it shows this black square here is ideal family size. The grey bar is actual fertility achieved by that cohort, and the circle below is the difference between them. So as you can see, whilst this difference varies by country, there is nonetheless a negative difference between the number of children intended and the number of children had by cohorts, and this is what is referred to as the fertility gap. So why does the fertility gap exist? Why is there this apparent mismatch between what people say they want and what they go on to do? Well, demographers have tried to approach this by using psychosocial theories of behavior. And the one I'm presenting here is the traits, desires, intentions, behavior framework, because it has very clear concepts which I think are useful to understanding why this gap might exist. So the framework outlines that all people have underlying motivations for wanting children, what they call traits and dispositions to feel and think in ways that affect childbearing. These are then translated into a general desire for children or ideal family size, how many children one would like to have in the presence of no obstacles. However, it's then translated and revised again based on accounting for information in the environment, obstacles to childbearing, to a more realistic intention for children. This group can sort of be divided into 2, sort of more general intentions for having children, as defined in the literature as an expectation. So taking into account various obstacles, how many children do you expect you might have? And then a more active short-term intention. So within the next 2 years, 3 years, how many do you think you will go on to have another child? So one is a bit more general, one is a lot more active. From the more active intention, we then follow this pathway to the eventual outcome of a birth. So the fertility gap arises from this point here, desire for children following the pathway down to birth. What is happening along this pathway that we see this mismatch? Well, there's 2 points where things can occur. Firstly, there's the obstacles that result in more realistic expectations, revising a desire down towards a more realistic expectation. And then also between once someone decides they would like to have a child in the short term, there can also be obstacles here allowing this intention to become unrealized. So the obstacle that this presentation focuses on specifically is the meta-vision of labour as a potential reason for explaining the fertility gap. So the most common and well-cited theory in demography in this area is the gender revolution theory. This theory states that in high-income settings, all countries have seen a general decline in fertility in conjunction with a public sphere revolution, meaning that relative to the 1950s, when the male breadwinner family model was the norm, increasingly more women are entering the labour force. However, men are not taking on as many housework duties in the home as women are, which results in a dual burden at point B. This is where fertility will be at its lowest, because managing both paid and unpaid labour responsibilities is a big burden on time, which having children would only exacerbate. The theory then states that fertility will only rise again once there's a subsequent private sphere revolution, when men start dividing the unpaid labour equally, and there is a move towards more egalitarian division of labour. So what evidence is there at present that gender division of labour could help explain the fertility gap? I've written a paper that's under review at the moment that's a systematic review of the literature very generally in this area about gender division of labour and fertility outcomes and intentions. You can see the searches I used here, and this was a big review of many things, and I described and synthesized 95 pieces of analysis, which included both macro level studies, outcomes, desires, intentions, qualitative papers, but of interest to what I'm presenting today. I also identified 4 papers that looked at realizing intentions for children. And by this, I mean studies that observe an individual at one point in time, see whether they want to have a child, and then they follow them over time to see whether they realize that intention. And this is the variable I think that is most relevant to the fertility gap. So generally, this review found overall, despite some heterogeneity, most studies found a positive link between a more egalitarian division of labour, gender roles, etc., and having more children. However, focusing just specifically on the papers that looked at realisation of intentions or desires, I found this area of the literature to be quite lacking. Firstly, there was only 4 studies, as I said. 2 of these had issues with how they built their conceptual framework. For example, they would look at someone's ideal family size and then only follow them for 3 years, which obviously has a bit of a censoring issue, because you're not going to observe whether they completed that intention throughout their life. Similarly, one did not follow women to the end of their reproductive period, despite having the correct measures. And finally, this was a very select group of studies. Most were from South Korea and one was from Italy. So building off this apparent lack in the literature, my thesis wants to address a few questions. So coming back to this pathway, firstly, I want to explore whether at this first junction, can I see that expectations are becoming sacrificed over time as an explanation for this apparent fertility gap? And if so, is this related to division of labour? Thirdly, I want to look at the second time point and see whether division of labour also affects realisation of intention. So once people actively intend to have a child, does division of labour prevent them from doing so? So throughout the presentation today, I'm going to be using 2 data sets. The first is from the US, and it's the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth, which is a cohort study following individuals who are aged 18 to 24 in 1979, and it follows them every 2 years up to the present day. This is a great survey for what I'm interested in, because for the women at least, I have complete fertility data. I can follow them from when they were young to when they finished their reproductive years. so I can really track what happens to their expected family size over time. I also have information in the survey on gender roles and also satisfaction with division of labour in terms of the independent variables I'm interested in. The second survey that I'm going to be using today is UK data. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the UK Household Longitudinal Survey. This, unlike the NLSY, is a panel survey, but it follows originally 5,500 households in the British Household Panel Survey, and then it resamples for Understanding Society 40,000 households. Unlike the NLSY, the benefit of this data set is I have very detailed information on individuals' job hours and their hours of domestic work. And I also have information on their expected family size over time, which is present in these 7 waves, which I will be using. So a slight comparison between the two, the NLSY is a cohort, so I can really see what happens over time. The UK panel, I only have a few waves and a smaller sample size, but I have much more detailed information on division of labour. So the first question I'll present today, do intentions for a second child become sacrificed after the birth of the first child in the USA and the UK? Why am I focusing on sacrificing after the first birth? Well, this is a time point where we know domestic burden increases for parents. It's also a time when domestic division of labour is known to become more gendered, with the woman taking on more responsibility than before the birth often. Thirdly, previous studies have highlighted that in Europe, at least, the fertility gap seems particularly driven by a lack of transition from 1 to 2 births. And finally, there's a very strong 2-child norm, as I showed at the beginning, strong 2-child ideal norm across high income settings, which makes it interesting to observe if and when this ideal changes. So methods, I'm using a piecewise linear growth curve model, and I'm following women from 5 years before their first birth to 5 years after the birth of their first child. And I'm seeing whether their expected family size changes during that time. I also add splines to this model from 1 year before the first birth and then every year after that. The reason I do this is to estimate the regression line for these years to see if there's a real change in slope occurring, and to try and see particularly if the first birth is a catalyst for a change in regression slope. So both the UK and the USA, I add various covariates to the model to see if they have some explanatory power. In terms of covariates shared, age, employment status, various demographic factors, and there's also a few covariates that differ between the 2 samples, but predominantly the ones that differ are to do with division of labour. I'm only going to present the covariates that are of particular interest to this presentation. If any of these are of particular interest to people listening, I can come back to them at the end. Sample-wise, I only included women who I had complete information on about their expected family size over time. I needed at least 3 observations within this time period in order for the growth curve model to perform effectively. I censored women at age 45, and for the UK sample, I excluded those with the first child prior to 1990 because I had too few observations. This left me with the numbers below, and I have 2 samples that I use. One is just 1-child women, and the other is all women who ever had children. And as you can see, the sample size in the USA is considerably larger than the one I have in the UK. So what did I find? Starting with 1-child women in the US. The 4 years prior to first birth, the 4 years prior to the year of pregnancy, I see a general downward slope from about 2 to 1.85 maybe. And then in the year of pregnancy, there is a uptick back upwards, which was significant in the model. In the year after first birth, it goes down, and that was a significant change. And then in the 4 years after that, it really plummets. So what I'm seeing here is one could argue that one-child women in the US are already on this trajectory before they begin first birth. There's a hump and then they continue downwards. But also it's interesting to note before the first birth, the expected family size is very much still around the 2 mark, whereas after first birth, it really goes down to very low levels, 1.5 here. So it does seem like first birth may be a catalyst for this. Comparing these one-child women to all women who ever had children, they're in the blue line above, and as you can see, they're very stable over time, if not increasing, in comparison to the one-child women who are already on a distinct downward trajectory. I also was interested to see whether this finding would replicate if I broke the USA down into smaller regions. The reason being that the USA is huge. It's like trying to make a generalizable finding for all of Europe. And I wondered whether if I broke it down into smaller regions, whether I would find the same trajectory for women in these different regions. And I did. I found significant differences in intercept. So whilst the South expect significantly fewer over time than the other regions, there was no significant differences in the slope of these trajectories. So it suggests that one-child women have a similar experience across the US. In terms of important covariates for one-child women, the first one was education came across strongly. So not only were there significant differences in intercept, with those who did not finish college expecting more than those who attended college, by the end they converge. And the other very significant covariate was age at first birth. This is still the same regression trajectory, but I've had to change the axis because there is such big differences. So those who have their first birth at age 20 or under start really high, 2.5, and have the steepest downward slope down to 1.6 roughly, whereas those who had their first birth age 36 or above, as you would expect, remain very stable around the one-child mark. So how does the US compare with the UK? So USA on the left, here's the UK on the right. So we can see that compared to the US, there's lower expected fertility among one-child women even before first birth. But again, we see this downward trend, and then in the year of pregnancy, a bit of an uptick. In the year after birth, it remains stable, and then, as in the US, it plummets after that. So I would say overall a similar pattern, despite overall lower expected fertility in the UK. However, these two data sets aren't directly comparable. As I said earlier, the US survey is a cohort, whereas Understanding Society is a panel. So I can't be sure that these one-child women in my panel have completed their childbearing and won't go on to have further children. I also don't have the month of birth for the UK data. So the timing of this first birth spline is less accurate than it is in the US. Also, as I mentioned, there's a smaller sample size. So on the US, I presented a comparison of the one child and those who have more than one child. And this is the same analysis for the UK. And we can see a very similar thing going on. Those who have 2 or more children remain pretty stable, if not increase over time. And those who are having one child are already distinct before first birth and go downwards over time. Important covariates, again, as in the US, age at first birth was strongly predictive, although this time I didn't find difference in slope, only in intercept. And the other thing that was very significant in this data set was expectation prior to first birth. So what I did was look at whether at any point prior to first birth, was there an intention to have more than one child, or did they always intend to have 1 or fewer children prior to first birth? And I found very distinct differences among the one-child women. So one-child women who intended to have 2 or more before first birth are stable, around 2, as you'd expect, and then you see a steep decline, whereas those who intended 1 or fewer before first birth seem to be going more up over time. I did find the same thing in the US, but I haven't presented that because I have such a small sample of women who intended one or fewer children before first birth. I think it was something like 11 women out of 1,000 intended to have fewer than 2 children before first birth. So it was very, very rare. But it did show a similar picture. So to summarize, both the US and the UK samples show a downwards trajectory for one-child women in their expected family size, both before and after first birth. This trajectory is distinct from the stable, if not upwards trend observed among other women who have children. And in the US, education, age, and geography were important explanatory factors, and age expectation prior to first birth were in the UK. But at this point, you're probably asking, I thought this presentation was about domestic division of labour. So that is what I will talk about next. So we've seen that expectations amongst one-child women certainly seem to be revised downwards over time. Is this in any way related to their domestic burden? Well, I looked at this in the UK because I have information on hours of both paid and unpaid work. And looking amongst all women who had children, I've stratified them here by hours of domestic work. And what I found was that those who do the most hours of domestic work, this dark blue line here, expect overall more children over time. And those who do the least housework expect fewest children over time. Looking at hours of paid work, I put this in grayscale apart from those who don't work, which is in this blue-green color. So prior to first birth, they're interesting in that they certainly don't expect the most children out of all the groups, but after first birth, they clearly accelerate upwards in comparison to the other groups of women who are doing some, if not a full-time job. Also interesting are these two lines here highlighted in blue, those who work 17 to 34 hours a week and those who do 35 to 37.5 hours a week. So basically women who have a full-time job contract or slightly less. These two groups have a different slope to the other trajectories. As you can see here, the other lines tend to tick a bit upwards over time, whereas, in the blue groups, they tend to drop a little bit more and then plateau. And I think this is interesting in that I can see from descriptively exploring this data set, I know women who work very long hours in their paid employment tend to also do few hours of domestic work. So I would speculate that women who have a dual burden lie in these two categories. I also combined both together, so hours of domestic work and hours in the job, and I found that the 36 to 50 group expected fewer children over time. And again, I expect this is the group that has highest dual burden, in that I can see in the data set those who work the longest hours overall are those who spend most of their time doing housework. So in extension of that, I also looked at percentage of total work that is housework, and I can see a clear gradation here with female homemakers in this blue line expecting the most children over time compared to the women who do the least housework. Lastly, I also looked at self-reported employment status. So in this blue line, these are all women who reported they were looking after the household and home, and everyone else went into black, which is a little bit crude perhaps, but we can really see that female homemakers have a very distinct trajectory compared to the other women in the sample. Again, they don't seem to, they're not intending the most children prior to first birth, but then after first birth, they really shoot up compared to other women who are working. So thus far, I've just looked at hours, but I was thinking, is there a way that I can try and capture dual burden a bit more comprehensively? Because it's not just about hours of work that the woman does, it's also about balancing the paid work with the unpaid work. So as a preliminary go at this, I tried to group women based on what I thought was theoretically sensible. So this group here, I classified as female homemakers, women who do fewer than 16 hours of paid work a week, but mostly 0 hours, and all hours of housework. So yes, there are a few women who are working here, but the majority of time is spent in the home. The next group I classified as having a small dual burden. So these are women who are working in and around the hours of a full-time job and are doing fewer or around 2 hours of housework a day. And then finally, my large dual burden group, these are women who again have a full-time job but are doing on average 2 or more hours of housework a day. So I looked at averages for these groups over time, and what I saw was both significant differences in intercept and slope among all women. Again, the female homemakers have a very different trajectory to women who work, but what was interesting was that these categories were in no way predictive when I did a model just for one-child women. And this could perhaps indicate there's a bit of selection going on, that the female homemakers are more likely to progress quicker onto second birth and thus are not included so much in the one-child model, but this is something I'm still exploring. So thus far, I've only looked at average effects within these groups. So they are time varying, but it's still the average effect for that group over time. What about change? That's what I'm really interested in. I know that from the literature, first birth is often a catalyst for more domestic labour and also more gendered labour. So how can I explore that? Well, on aggregate, accumulating them all together, on the bottom here, I have survey observation points, so not years. And I've done it this way in order to summarize the data better, but just be aware that's not year anymore. And whilst this isn't completely accurate, as I don't know exactly at which point along the pathway these women are, I think there's a pretty clear distinction before and after this black line of first birth. Before the black line, we're seeing majority are sort of doing a bit of both, although a slight increase over time in the amount of female homemakers. But after first birth, a real rise in both those women who have a large dual burden and female homemakers relative to what we saw before. I also plotted individual pathways of division of labour for these women in this lasagna plot here. And at the top here are women that I observe across the first birth interval at line 0. These are women that I only observe after first birth, and these are women that I only observe before first birth. There's quite a lot going on here, so I'm going to break it down, focusing first of all at these women here who are yellow. So these are all women in the interval prior to first birth who had, according to my definition, a female homemaker division of labour. And what I observe over the forthcoming survey waves is that whilst there is an increase in the number of women returning to work over time, the majority do still remain female homemakers. This is in contrast to those who have a small division of labour in the observation prior to first birth. They seem to split into 3 groups approximately. There's a group here that drop out of the labour force and become female homemakers. There's a group that seem to sort of largely carry on as before, and there's a group here who switch to have a larger dual burden after first birth. And finally, those who have a large dual burden in the interval before first birth, they seem to split more into 2. There's a group that drops out and becomes female homemaker, and a group that carries on as before. So just descriptively looking at this, there seem to be sort of roughly 6 common groups here among women. And I was interested to see whether I could find these same groupings using a cluster analysis. This is still preliminary work, and I would be extremely grateful to hear any and all ideas you have. So this was the result of cluster analysis. Instead of the 6 groups I observed, it produced me with a 5 cluster solution, seemed to work best. The first one here are women who, for the most part, remain female homemaker consistently over time. The second one are those who, in the interval prior to first birth, have a small dual burden and then drop out of the labour force after first birth. Thirdly, those who have a small dual burden pretty much consistently over time. Fourth, those who have a sort of mix of small and large dual burden over time. And lastly, those who have a large dual burden prior to first birth, a real increase in large dual burden after the first birth and sort of consistently carry on with that large burden over time. So cluster analysis gave me these 5 solutions, and I wanted to go back to the growth curve models and see how they would perform. So firstly, the first group I've got here are those who consistently have a small dual burden over time. And I'm sorry, I can't see the screen, and I think there was a question, but I will have a look later if that's okay. If it's something important, Francesca, you can message me. Okay, so these are women who have a consistent small dual burden over time. They have, sorry, this is for all women who have had a child. So we see a downward trajectory, a bit of a hump, and then stable. These are the other 2 groups of women who combine both paid and unpaid work in some form, and they are sort of around each other. But the black group, the small dual burden group, seems to go a bit further down than the rest. The 2 distinct groups are firstly those who have a small dual burden prior to first birth, and then drop out of the labour force. They have much more of an upwards trajectory after first birth, and the female homemakers are in a different category of their own. They expect overall most children over time, and there's a general upwards increase over time. So to summarise this part, on aggregate, I think I can see some pretty clear differences in division of labour before and after birth. And after clustering, I can see that the groups where women aren't in the labour market were strongly predictive of expecting more children over time compared to the groups that do work, which are much more stable. So perhaps this is suggestive there could be some selection here going on in terms of who remains one child women and who goes on to have a second child. But as I said, I need to do a lot more sensitivity analysis for this bit of analysis. First of all, to evaluate whether I think the clusters are coherent theoretically, although I do think they are. I also need to look at the differentiation between the clusters statistically, and I need to also explore whether the dual burden groups I created are meaningful, because I made them up. So I need to do a bit more probing there, whether those are meaningful to what I'm trying to explore. And I also need to work on assessing causality a little bit better, because there are several things happening simultaneously here, right? So there's the first birth, there's a change in division of labour, and then I'm trying to look at expectations over time. So in order to disentangle exactly what's going on, I think I need to develop the methodology a little bit more. So that's where this work is going. So thus far, I've presented work that focuses on this junction of the behavioural pathway. The last bit of analysis I'm going to show today, again, is work in progress, but it does division of labour affect realisation of intention. So this last point on the pathway, once an individual says they want a child, do they go on to do so? And I'm using here the USA cohort study to look at this. So the USA study has this question: do you expect to have another child, and if so, within how many years? Using the answer to this question, I group women into 3 categories: whether they had a child within the stated time frame that they gave, whether they had a child but later than they stated, or whether they never went on to have a second child in a multinomial logistic regression. I also added various predictive variables down here, similar to what I had in the models presented earlier. I must stress that the sample here is a bit different to the work I presented earlier. It's much more selective because this survey only asked this question from 1994 onwards, which means the women of the cohort were already aged 29 to 37. This means it's a select group of older women with later second childbearing, and indeed it census around 85% of second children ever born. So please be aware that this is a select group of women. So descriptively, of these women, of these 585 women, 86.7% said they wanted their second child within the next 2 years. and 41.7% achieved the second child within the time frame they wanted. 20% did but later, and 38.3% never did. So despite the fact I have quite a selective sample, there's still a variety of outcomes here. So what I find? Well, in terms of the predictive variables I was interested in, frequency of arguments about housework and childcare and gender role attitudes, I didn't find anything thus far. However, I'm going to talk about in the next slide how I'm developing this model further to try and address this. Things that did come out as predictive were firstly having a spouse. So if one had a spouse, they were less likely to be in this third category of never fulfilled intention for a child, i.e. If you don't have a spouse relative to having no spouse or partner, it's difficult to have a second child. Age was also strongly predictive. So the older you are, the more likely you are to end up in the never fulfilled intention category. And also education. So the more educated you are, less likely to be in category 3. And year first child was born. The more recent the first child was born, the less likely you are to be within this category 3. So this is still work in progress. The first issue I need to address is that my independent variables are not particularly comprehensive to address what I'm really interested in, which is dual burden and division of labour between partners. In order to address this, I'm using a method proposed by this paper here, using propensity score matching as a technique to create a synthetic data set which combines the longitudinal elements of the NLSY cohort with a really detailed information about time use in the American Time Use Survey, from which I can create some much more nuanced and comprehensive categories of division of labour. This is still something I'm working on, but hopefully this will work, and it will be exciting to try this method. The second issue I'm facing with this paper is I'm aware that this is a selective sample, not only in terms of age, but also this group is going to be a much more actively pronatal group than those who aren't in there, because they've already stated they want to intend to have a child, and thus are more likely to go on and fill that intention than those who are a bit uncertain. So in light of that, I may need to switch to using something like a probit model, which accounts for selection better rather than a multinomial regression. So to conclude, firstly, I explored, do expectations become sacrificed over time for among one-child women? And indeed, it seems so that before first birth, they intend in and around more like 2 children, and after first birth, it really plummets. And is this related to division of labour? As I said, this is still ongoing work, and I need to much more sensitivity analysis, but what was clear is that female homemakers and women who aren't involved in the labour market have quite different trajectories compared to those who are. Thirdly, does division of labour affect realisation of intentions? This was the multinomial regression I just showed, and it's not conclusive as yet, but I'm still exploring how to improve this model. And lastly, something that I haven't explored today is that thus far people leaving, but the other reason that the fertility gap might exist is because when people say they want a child, they don't actually really know what they want, which is a much more psychological explanation. And so just quickly, the last paper I intend to do in my thesis is to try and grapple to what extent do reproductive intentions align with behaviour, because we theorize that if someone says they intend to have a child, they will follow the appropriate behaviors in order to achieve that, or vice versa. But that may not always be the case. So what I'm proposing is to use the American data set. I can see what one-child women expected, whether they were expecting to have a child prior to first birth. Once they have a first birth, I have a question on, have you ever used contraception to avoid becoming pregnant? And using this question, I can try and construct to what extent people were behaving appropriately in line with what they expected prior to first birth. So if they stopped using contraception in order to become pregnant, I would classify this as, a planned pregnancy with coherent behavior with what was expected. If no, I can also categorize whether post that birth, how the mother feels towards that child. So it might not be planned, but still wanted. And also, depending on this question, it could be mistimed, or they were just ambivalent, or it's unwanted. So in summary, I'm going to follow women across a pathway. What did they expect prior to first child? What did they do in terms of contraception when before their first birth, and how does that then translate into wantedness for that child after birth? So thank you much for listening to me today, and I hear your questions and feedback. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alyce.